A new report says the Trump administration is considering a major step to roll back protections for transgender people. According to a New York Times story published Sunday, the Department of Health and Human Services is considering defining gender as, quote, a biological, immutable condition determined by genitalia at birth. A memo cited by the Times says any dispute about one's sex would be settled using genetic testing. Now, that change would overturn an Obama-era education policy that loosened the government's definition of sex. That change was meant to protect against discrimination based on gender identity. Now, it led to legal challenges over bathrooms, military enlistment, and single-sex education programs. Today, the Department of Human Services responded to the report, saying we do not comment on alleged leaked documents that purport to indicate the status of deliberations or the focus of the department. However, the department confirmed they are reviewing the issue after a court found the Obama administration's definition of sex to be overbroad. Gregory T. Angelo is the national president of Log Cabin Republicans, an organization that works within the Republican Party to advocate equal rights for LGBT people. He joins me now from Washington. Thank you for your time. Let's start with this Department of Health and Human Services memo. What do you think the administration is trying to accomplish, and do you think there's a problem with what they're doing?
Well, I think what the administration is trying to accomplish is rolling back the regulations and the rules that were implemented when President Obama thought that he could just use a pen and a phone to implement legislation. Certainly, Log Cabin Republicans has fought for federal civil rights protections for the LGBT community, the entire LGBT community, protections for both sexual orientation and gender identity. And if there is anything that's coming out of this, as you noted, a purported rule change, it's just being considered right now, it's that the LGBT community really needs to focus on what we have focused on for the last 48 years, up until the last 2 years of the Obama presidency, and that is federal protections in law for the LGBT community. Is my conservative opinion that is the cleanest and the strongest way to ensure that those protections are enshrined and they can't be taken away just as easily.
And let me understand that position and make sure I understand your policy preference. The issue here is there are already protections against discriminating against sex. And the question becomes, what does sex mean? And does sex include gender identity? I guess the main policy question I'm interested in is if you think there should be protections against discriminating against gender identity, and if so, how that should be done.
Yeah, well, there are conflicting opinions about whether or not sex does include gender identity and even sexual orientation. We have court rulings around the country that are divided on this point. And I believe rather than have this issue decided by the Supreme Court ultimately, the administration has sought to come up with its own definition. And that's why, at Log Cabin Republicans, we are advocating for federal legislation that specifically addresses sexual orientation and gender identity so that there's no question as to whether or not sex includes that.
Do you think that the headline of the Times story is accurate? It says that this move would define transgender people out of existence. Is that a concern for you?
The headline was most definitely a cause for concern. The actual article itself was much more demure and specific when it came to the specific actions that the Trump administration was considering. I think that the media certainly has an obligation at this time to headline their articles in a way that doesn't just encourage clickbait, but actually reflects the story. If the headline of the Times article yesterday was, amid confusion, Trump administration seeks to provide stronger definition for sex, I think a lot of the hysteria that you've seen over the last 24 hours would not have occurred.
Candidate
and by the
Trump,
way, Brooke, I would just add that, you know, we've seen this before. I saw it a year ago where the LGBT community took to the streets saying that it was assured that President Trump and the Trump administration would be implementing a religious freedom executive order that would allow anyone to discriminate against the LGBT community just by citing their sincerely held religious beliefs. People took to the streets in protest. The LGBT community was at the White House, and that religious freedom executive order never came to pass. So I'm somewhat reluctant to specifically comment on something that even HHS says is something that's being considered, but certainly has not been implemented as of our conversation today.
Candidate Trump showed support for the LGBT community in the campaign trail quite a bit in his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention. Let's take a little listen to him on the campaign trail.
I will do everything in my power to protect our LGBTQ citizens from the violence and oppression of a hateful foreign ideology. Believe me.
How has he done so far?
That quote that you presented was President Trump specifically talking about ISIS, a group of radical Islamists that executes gay people, cuts off their heads, throws us off of rooftops. And in terms of combating radical Islam and ISIS, I think that this president has done a tremendous job. So that would be a campaign promise fulfilled. But I would also point out—
that promise, though, in that paragraph, though, was in a larger context where he made a comment in support of LGBT Americans. The crowd cheered, and he said how happy he was to hear a Republican crowd cheer at that line. So putting aside the ISIS part, on the LGBT part, how do you think the president has done?
I think the president is governing as someone who is inclusive of all different types of people, including the LGBT community. This is the first sitting Republican president to formally recognize an LGBT advocacy organization. I'm honored to say Log Cabin Republicans received that accolade. We have an openly gay man who is currently serving as our United States ambassador to Germany. And just last week, President Trump nominated an openly gay man, actually of Filipino descent, to serve on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. That would be something that, in my estimation, is not only a win for the LGBT community, but also people of color.
Your organization at one point wrote, "No Supreme Court justice in history has done more to advance gay rights than Justice Kennedy, now retired." Many would agree. He legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states with his decision. Now he's replaced by Brett Kavanaugh. Any concerns about what this shift in the court could mean to that community?
I mean, we will have to wait to see how Brett Kavanaugh rules if and when these questions ultimately come before him. But we do have an indication of that. During his hearings, he basically came as close as you could for someone who is a Supreme Court nominee to indicating how he would rule on issues related to specifically marriage equality, where he said the Supreme Court's Obergefell ruling that Kennedy authored, bringing marriage equality to all 50 states, is accepted precedent. He also, I would add, was a speaker years ago when he was part of the George W. Bush White House at an event for Log Cabin Republicans in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. This hardly sounds like the actions of someone who would be a raging homophobe jurist. So I would say I'm optimistic about the prospects of Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. But like so many of our members around the country, our number one concern is that they be a constitutional conservative and observe the text of the Constitution in that regard.
Okay, Gregory T. Angelo of the Log Cabin Republicans, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Brooke.